Hello, StoryBook family. My name is Whitney Mwangi, and I'm the founder of the StoryBook. The conversation we're about to have with you today is, are you really okay? And we will be having guests who will share with us 5 tips on how young Africans can prioritize their mental health well-being. Be sure to stay tuned because this time we have surprises for you and we would not want you to miss out. So thank you to the two of you for making time to join us today for the World Mental Health Day conversation. And we'll start with a round of introductions. Why don't you tell us what you do, Olive, and a little bit about yourself?
My name is Olive Ndiang'ui. I'm a psychologist, a therapist. I run a mental health page called Prometheus Kenya. We talk about mental health issues. And I also run a group practice where I'm the lead therapist and I have 3 other therapists that I work with.
Pleasure. Welcome. Over to you, Onyango. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Otieno is my name. I'm a poet and a writer. I tell stories for healing and connection. I also operate a safe space for sexually abused boys and men. And I'm also a trauma therapist.
All right. So we will move on to our first question. Mental health is a vital part of our overall health and wellness. Yet the conversation around wellness is very much stigmatized. Tell us a little bit about you and your journey to being a bold mental health advocate despite the stigma. We'll start with you, Onyango.
I grew up in a violent home, firstborn of 3 kids. And my parents fought a lot. My dad was also quite violent towards me. I didn't know how that would affect my brain and my body and how I perceived myself. So I had my first bout of depression at 15 years old. I remember I was a Form 1 student at some school in the then Nyanza province. And I would start skiving class. I just felt like my body was heavy, so I didn't want to go to read. I was just hanging out like in the dormitories and playing football. I just felt like withdrawn, right? Then by the time I was 16, these issues now started catching up with me, and I started running away from home. So I've been a street boy at some point. Then I became suicidal still at 16. Ran away from home, wanted to kill myself. By some miraculous things that happened, I obviously didn't die. But then I've had bouts of depressive episodes over the course of time throughout my 20s, and it was until 2017 when I had my last episode, and I came out to talk about it. I had idealized taking my life at the time. I had lost a friend to suicide and another person who died through low blood pressure, and they were my peers. I didn't have a job. I was coming off a very unhealthy relationship as well, and things just felt like I was stuck, So I remember coming home this day and taking a 2-hour-long shower, asking myself, what am I going to do to myself when I get out of this room, So something in my head is like, should we jump off the building? Another thing is like, should I take a rope and hang myself? But then as it was when I was 16, writing came to my rescue. So I remember leaving my bathroom naked, wet. I just opened my laptop and went to Facebook and wrote that I feel suicidal today. And, people like me look together, we look strong, and we are the people who hold space for other people, but I am overwhelmed in this moment. And that changed my life.
Okay. Wow, it's a powerful story, and thank you for sharing it with us. There's a lot that we can unpack from what you just mentioned, but for a beginner, knowing about depression and having the boldness to admit that maybe I'm going through this, was this something that happened in the moment, or did you realize it later?
What exactly?
So you said that you had your first depressive moment, when you were really young.
Right.
And I'm thinking about the information that we have about depression. I think it's recently that people are beginning to talk about depression, what it looks like and how it manifests. So for you, was it something that made sense to you at the time? Or did you look back and you're like, you know what, that was depression?
So when I came out with my story in 2017, I started attending therapy, and I was also quite curious that, because so many people wrote to me saying they were going through similar experiences. And I wondered how come we were so many who were experiencing this thing, but nobody was talking about it. So I started searching online what is available about these situations, and I am coming across terms like depression and anxiety and PTSD. It's like, oh wow, what are these things? A whole universe. And so when I was diagnosed again, so that's when it started making sense to me, because somebody explained my pain and it felt liberating. So when I went back in time, that's when I started recognizing, at 15 when I was feeling this way, this is what was going on, right? And now everything started making sense going backward.
Okay. And people say life makes sense backwards sometimes, yeah? Okay, I'm glad you lived on to share this story with us. And now to turn to you, Olive. Tell us about how you got into this journey and the practice, and even bringing other therapists on board.
Well, it's interesting because my first degree is actually not in anything close to psychology. My first degree is in architecture. I had always been this kid who was very interested in the nature of reality and life. Why are we here? What is this about? What's our purpose? So I went into architecture, because I passed, and, you're supposed to do a big course when you pass, as is expected. But somewhere in the middle of it, I felt like I was really lost, I had lost touch with myself, with the person that I was. And I actually did go into a bit of a depression in campus at that time. And it was really interesting to me because everything was great. I was in a great course, doing well. I was seeing a person that I cared about very much, and it was a happy, healthy relationship. My family was good. For all intents and purposes, I should have been happy and fulfilled, but I was feeling very, very disconnected. And I realized that I had found myself kind of following a script that I thought was what my life was supposed to be like, as opposed to being authentically myself, So I started to deliberately choose to do what I cared about and only what I cared about. That led me to leaving architecture and now pursuing a career in psychology, going to study psychology. Of course, I'm just shortening that story, but there was a lot of upheavals in between that, as you can imagine. In an African home, we value education very much. We value stability very much. So making a decision like that and choosing to make that journey was a very big deal. It took a lot of courage, but I'm very happy that I'm always saying that I look back and I'm very grateful to that 22-year-old for her boldness, because if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here today. So I went into this because I realized that we can very easily lose touch with ourselves, and that ability or that inability to connect with yourself is a really big part of what causes people to go into mental health issues. Experiences such as depression and anxiety sometimes have their roots in something as simple as that, as simple as just inauthenticity. A mission for me to help people connect with themselves and find themselves. So this is how Prometheus was born, and that's kind of been my mission throughout my practice.
All right, so it's good to hear your journey, and 22 is a very young age for you to make such a bold decision, going against the grain of culture and family. So what does Prometheus mean, and how did it become a choice for you to give to the journey that you're now taking?
Yeah, so Prometheus is a Greek titan. It's actually a mythological tale of this Greek titan who stole fire from the gods, right? So a titan was basically something in between a god and a human, and he stole fire from the gods to give to man as a gift for them to be able to advance. And the reason why I chose that, first, I had always been interested in Greek mythology. I find it quite interesting and fascinating. I find mythological stories very interesting because in a sense, they're like a repository for all human experiences. And what you'll find is that myths are very, they sort of co-occur across different cultures. Yeah, so in a sense, it's sort of like this thing that unites all of us. So I found that story was very reminiscent of the process of becoming or of, coming into your own, because there's a lot of difficulties that go through that journey. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, once you have that experience, once you've become this person and you've had this awareness of yourself, inevitably you feel this desire to light that bulb in everyone else's mind, so to speak, you know what I mean? Because you recognize how much value it's brought to yourself. Mm-hmm. And you sort of feel like, wow, this is something that everybody should experience. Everyone should have this experience. Mm-hmm. So he's a hero to humanity. And I actually think that everybody who takes any chance to do anything bold and brave for the sake of others is a hero to themselves and to everyone around them.
Right. So you both bring very interesting perspectives to the conversation, different sides of, backgrounds and indeed heroes, mental health heroes.
Don't you just love stories? Stories shape how we understand the world, our place in it, and our ability to change it. We are all products of our backgrounds, perceptions, and experiences, which all form how we interpret the world. So we all have unique stories to share. What are we without stories? If you're a sucker for inspirational stories, you'll feel right at home at the StoryBook. Let's keep the conversation going. We just can't wait to hear from you.
I hope that the young people who are watching us today are going to appreciate the perspective that you bring, because it's not every day that we see bold young people making their dreams come alive. So I will move on to the next question. Research has revealed that there are about 9 mental health workers for every million people in Africa. As an expert in this field, what would you say is the cause of few mental health practitioners? I know for you, Onyango, how your journey started was out of experience and perspective, and for you, more or less, I believe, practice and also an interest. So why don't we start with you, Olive? Why do you think there's such a huge disparity in the need versus the caretakers, if I would say?
I think that's interesting. I'd be very curious to know the background of those statistics, because just anecdotally, from my own experience being in school, right, we have a lot of classmates. Right. So I wonder where all these psychologists go. Right. I find that what tends to happen is market forces. Okay. People train as psychologists, but when they go out there is no work necessarily, there are no employment opportunities. Right. Only very recently has, like, the Kenyan government, for example, constituted a board of psychologists. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, to a very large extent, there had not been any psychologists being hired in government institutions. So there's like a gap. Okay. So then if that happens, you come out with a psychology degree, you're not going to pursue that as a profession because it doesn't make sense. You're going to end up finding something else to do that you can make like a living out of. Right. So I think that there are a lot of mental health professionals who are trained, but they might not necessarily be going into the space as a livelihood because it's not possible for them to do it. Okay. Because this is something that I always say, mental health is healthcare. It should not be relegated to the space of like the private sector. It's something that the government has to take on as a healthcare priority and employ psychologists and employ counselors so that they can offer the service. It shouldn't be. Otherwise, what happens is that a gap exists because more often than not, people can't afford private healthcare. Right. Yeah, it's expensive.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that perspective, Olive. What do you think, Onyango? Why is there a gap?
I think maybe part of that beginning is our cultural understanding or perceptions of what mental health is, or is not. For example, where we are coming from as a continent, we used to have traditional healers and medicine men and whatnot. So people would go to these healers and they would try to figure out what's going on with somebody in your family and stuff like that. And then as a people, we also experienced deeply ingrained cultural and social interruptions with what colonialism did. And so even our self-identity really changed. Then in recent history, our understanding of the need of a psychologist is only when something is really extreme, that somebody really lost their minds, and they need to go to a mental hospital, right? So even the policymakers, the leaders, the political leaders, the government as an entity will say, okay, for this group of people, we'll create this major hospital, and then all of them will be going there. Extreme cases, right? But then we haven't understood mental health as a spectrum, right? As a reality that exists within, different experiences that people have in their day-to-day, right? So if our leaders are thinking of it like that, is the people in power are thinking of it like that, then it's almost obvious that the general population will think of it like that, right? So there's no education about it because of lack of information that leads to ignorance, that leads to neglect, right? Before we think of institutionalizing, like, what Olive is saying. So the secret is at the attitude level. If we do not have enough people in power, enough people in our homes who understand what mental health really is, then it's going to be really difficult because it's so easy, by the way, also, Olive, we can come up with the structures, but if people don't know why the structures are important, they won't use the structures. They won't. We will have psychologists and therapists in offices and workplaces, but they will never be used because people will still feel, this is not ours. It's a white people's thing. I don't want to show that I'm weak. All these different attitudes that people are struggling with. So I feel like there's a lot of psychoeducation that is needed in regards to this conversation, just so that even as we are pulling the numbers up in institutional wise, the general population also have some kind of basic understanding, if not more, about what the need for this service really is about.
Okay. And I believe the issue does not just relate at the policymakers level, even for the population as well, as you've rightfully mentioned. And the statistics now, the number of men who are submitting to depressive episodes, maybe through suicide or, other repercussions, maybe abuse through drugs and etc., is almost double the number of women. But it appears that there's more women who actually experience mental health issues. And so given this background, what you've mentioned about the policymakers and the systems, what do you think women can do to support each other for mental health? And you can obviously speak from a perspective of a man and how you've related to women, and you can speak from the perspective of you as a young woman and perhaps clients as well.
What women can do to support each other in the mental health process. Okay, I that's a very interesting statistic, and it points to a very interesting dynamic, because what it means is that women, like, there's a gender disparity for sure. Everybody experiences mental health issues. That's a fact, regardless of gender. But women might be more open to discussing it because we've created social spaces where women feel that it's okay for them to express difficulty, pain, struggle, whereas we haven't created the same space for men. Men don't feel that they have that space. In fact, we ridicule men when they express themselves in that way.
Right.
So for women, women have that space. They should foster it further, right? Create environments amongst themselves where such a discussion can happen. Even teach like younger generations about what to do when they come into such experiences.
Right.
And create an avenue for younger generations to do that, because I think that's probably the biggest challenge that comes across, or that I've noticed more often than not, is that the issue becomes more problematic because it's not dealt with early on. It becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then finally there's now this explosive moment where now this person has an episode of this nature or that nature, and then now suddenly we're like, oh, how can we help? But before that experience, something has been going on. You know what I mean? Something has been going on for a while. This person has probably been trying to talk about it, has probably been expressing themselves in some way or other, but then maybe they're just not in an environment that's supportive or that's hearing them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And over to you, Onyango. How do you think men can support each other to keep their mental health check?
That's an interesting question, because men often do not support each other when it comes to these issues. There was a research I read that said when boys are younger, they have more intimate relationships with each other. But then that starts changing towards their puberty. And then as they grow older, then these emotional friendships start, like, they're just gone. And why is that? When boys are getting towards their puberty, they start to want to be associated with the adult men around them. And most times, what are their peers doing? The older boys around them doing? What are the adult males around them doing? You know, there's all these scenarios of violence and drugs and crime and trying to be cool and all that. Why? Because the power struggles start there. You know, when I'm 7 years old and I have a best friend who's a boy like me, we are not thinking of overpowering each other. We are just thinking of, we are children, we are just connecting, that's all. Right? But then at 15, all of a sudden, I want Mike to know that Olive likes me.
I'm the man.
Yeah, I'm the man. Right. So, you know, my voice is breaking and I have a little chest out there and stuff like that, and I have cool sneakers and shit. So I'm separating, Mike and I are separating because of all these things that are happening in our culture, in my society, in our environment. And for me, my biggest challenge for men is we have to go back there. We have to go back to 7 years old and 6 years old and start holding each other's hands again. Not to be afraid, oh, it's going to be a homo, whatever. Because where did those ideas come from? How come it wasn't homosexual when you were 6, when you were 7?
I see.
Right? Right? So that over-sexualization of male intimacy, that's a huge problem we're dealing with today in our world. But then also it is the socialization that men have had about the expectation society has of them. And I have to keenly mention patriarchal society, right? And to say that patriarchy affects everybody. So you'd also have women who have these expectations over men, right? And men have these expectations of themselves and also of other men.
Okay.
All right. So it is that idea. You have to be strong all the time. You don't talk about your problems. I remember one day when this is 2015 again, my parents were fighting and I had enough of it. So I dared to call them for a meeting. Call my parents for a meeting, which is suicidal, really.
It is.
Yeah, and because that's how deep things were. You can imagine.
Right.
So that's kind of like parenting your parents, you know. My mom and I, we were fairly friends, so we would talk. But then with dad, you never knew what was going to come. It was always a risk. So among the many things he said, there's one statement he made that it changed my life. And he said, he doesn't come to me with his problems because I'll think he's weak. That was major. That was major. I don't come to you with my problems because you think I'm weak.
Right.
And in my head, I'm thinking, this dude, I've lived with this dude for 27 years. I know his weaknesses. What is it that he thinks in his mind? I see him as a perfect person, that I don't know his weaknesses, that he has to perform and act as though he's perfect so that he can please me. But the idea, his story is that a father always has to be strong.
Right.
You have to provide, you have to do all these things. Your children cannot see you as a weak person. Right? Because what? He'll lose respect, all those things, and honor and all that stuff that men are told they should aspire for. Right? So it is disconnecting myself from the illusion that I have to have honor and respect as a man. Right? And think more of being authentic with my emotions, with my thoughts, with my connections, with my friendships, with who I am and how I navigate the world. So how do we support each other? Let's start thinking of how life was when we were 7 years old and we were just talking about everything. We have to go back there.
Okay.
Yes.
That's lovely.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting concept because it takes us back to vulnerability. Accepting who you are, your flaws, even if you're going against the grain, what the society expects, what the society thinks is powerful, is respectful, is worth of honor, and you deciding that I'm going to go in this direction and I'm going to express myself in this way. And you mentioned, Onyango, that even women have certain expectations, not just on themselves, but also on men. And I was smiling on the inside because I'm definitely guilty of that. I make fun of my male friends. Wow, bromance, you guys are going for a drink? And maybe it's time for us to stop that and just accept that we can be, you can share, you can open up, you can talk about not being okay, because the topic of today is, are you okay? Are you really okay?
That perspective was very interesting, Onyango, and it's actually made me think about now the female side of the coin, because I think for women what we miss out on is that we stop playing. I think that's the one thing that I really noticed the most. So men actually keep up the play culture. I suppose it's probably the only thing that's left. In terms of even just a place of connection. It's like you guys will go and play football together and whatnot. But women stop playing. Women have interactions which are very social, but also very controlled and very, there's a lot of heavy expectation for women amongst each other in terms of how you show up. Right. And you're not allowed to be messy or tomboyish, because that sort of infringes on, especially the older you grow and you're going into this marriageable age, you're supposed to, be this very demure and put together woman. And I think it's actually very burdening. It's a very burdening experience. And I think that lack of play has a really huge impact on your emotional health, because physically it's good for you to run around and be rained on, or I don't know, you know what I mean? We won't even go swimming because of our hair. I mean, honestly, it's unfortunate. So I think that aspect, it got to me, because I was like, I think for us what we lack is that we don't play anymore.
Right. I like that. And maybe we should play some more, right? And just be free, be honest, be ourselves. Though I don't want to fight with you on that, Olive, because I feel like, sometimes you go on a date and the guy just shows up. This guy, he just came with his shirt, no lotion, no nothing. Well, we will show up, but still, man, I understand we are keeping our mental health in check, no pressure, but
No, but I mean, there's no reason why you can't go have a fun time out in the woods and roll around in the mud and be rained on, then go home and shower and show up for a date looking nice.
Okay, fine.
I mean, we can do both.
We're safe now. Yeah, all right. So research has shown that adolescents in Africa are the most affected by mental health issues. 1 in 7 adolescents experience mental health breakdowns. So bringing this back to Kenya, 1 in 2 adolescents report clinically elevated anxiety and depression. How can parents and peers support specifically adolescents struggling with their mental health. I'm not sure if any of you is a parent, but from your interactions, I mean, you were children once, and how would you see that your parents could have supported you? Let's start with you, Olive.
I think it's interesting that you should say that. Well, I suppose to some degree it is a pointer to a mental health problem. At the same time, I think it's also a natural thing because teenagers are naturally very emotionally reactive.
Right.
It has something to do with how their brains have developed, and there's a sort of overdevelopment of like the emotional components and an underdevelopment of the cognitive components that happens naturally. So that over emotional thing that teenagers tend to have, it's typical across the world, right? But then of course it's true, then that becomes probably a point where yes, a problem can come up, or some kind of fracture point can come up. I think a very big part of it is, I think, a lack of connection. Okay. We actually choose around that time to take our children to boarding school. Okay. So they've been living at home, seeing every day, blah, blah, blah. Then there's a sudden rip. So I'm not really necessarily saying that we shouldn't take kids to boarding school. I know that's a huge cultural norm that, I might like really flare people's perspectives if I suggest something differently should be happening. But I think it's a big fracture, and it happens very suddenly and very intensely because these are long periods of time. Right. And then these kids go and maybe they don't ever feel the capacity to have like a deep engagement or connection with their parents anymore. Right. Maybe even before then they've not been having that experience. Okay. Maybe parents, and maybe this is something that happened mostly when in our generation growing up, a lot of our parents had this perspective, okay, you're being taken to school, you're being fed, you're fine. So I don't necessarily have to be there like talking to you all the time or having a relationship with you. But that attunement is a very big part of how we develop emotionally and how we learn how to manage our emotional experience, label them, understand them, make meaning from them. So when these intense emotional experiences are happening to these kids at teenagehood, what level of connection do they have with their parents? Are their parents present with them? Are they able to talk to them? If especially kids have been raised in a very authoritarian style, then there's a lot of fear, right, that they have towards this. So this is your caregiver, but you're afraid of them. Right. Of course, you're not going to express maybe thoughts that you're having about your sexuality or other ideas that you might have that you think that they might be against, right? So then, of course, you keep that stuff to yourself. Inevitably, yes, it's going to cause a problem. So I think at the bottom of it, a lot of mental health issues are really an issue of connection. Okay. So creating spaces in which teenagers are able to connect, to emotionally connect to adults around them, to feel safe, to have ideas that are even different, and imagine that those ideas will be listened to, maybe not necessarily fostered and like, oh yes, let's do this different thing, but listened to, engaged, discussed, as opposed to shunned and pushed away, and then now putting this person in a place where they're sort of like isolated, or they're sort of having to isolate themselves.
Okay. And the issue of connection comes back again, and I'm curious, do you think it's a concept of them not being connected with themselves, and so they don't know how to transmit that connection to their adolescents or children?
That's very likely. Yeah, because I think inevitably, if you didn't grow up having those experiences, then you might not know how to have those experiences with your children. Okay. I actually have had so many experiences with parents of children who are either teenagers or going into teenagehood, who are very completely unsure how to relate to their kids, who are now starting to ask them questions around their sexuality, or saying that they like this person. Forget even teenagehood, actually, because these kids have these questions even when they're younger.
Yes.
And there's a lot of awkwardness, right? And then that translates. Like you might not imagine that your kid catches on, but they catch on. And they realize that, when I asked this question, this was the reaction. So they're not going to ask it again, but they'll still have the question and it'll still bug them. They'll probably find other places to find those kind of answers and that sort of thing. And maybe they will internalize the idea that these are not things that are supposed to be discussed. So I understand the parent's perspective, because I think sometimes we parent bash a little bit.
Yes.
We shouldn't, especially for us who are not parents.
Right.
I think it's a bit hypocritical. It's hard, I can imagine, for a parent, because this is someone who you're trying to take care of and you don't want them to have dangerous experiences. So when you hear them say something that you imagine is dangerous, immediately it makes you panic a little bit. I think it's helpful to even admit to the child that, hey, this is something that I wasn't quite sure how to discuss with you, but I'm glad that you're asking me about it. I think it's something that's important. We should talk about it. Maybe give me a day. I want to think about it so I can give you a good answer, so that you don't have to tell them something when you're not prepared already. Right. But ultimately, do have that conversation with them. Be like, okay, this thing that you brought up, yes, ask me again. What is it that you wanted to know? But then ability to do that also, it's true, you're right, is a factor of emotional maturity and growth, which sometimes people don't have even as they go into parenthood.
Right.
It's true.
It's something you learn on the job, and you are bringing a thought, a memory that I had. I saw a report saying that the youth in Africa get their information from social media, one, and then 2, from the church, from the opinion leaders, and then 3, I believe it was from their peers, their friends, and their parents, I think, came maybe number 7 or 10 after magazines and everything. So that's an issue. There's definitely a need to build trust and connection, as you mentioned. So let's hear from you, Onyango. You called your parents for a meeting. So it's a different level on your part.
Well, I generally feel that parenting is hard. Your parenting is hard. It really is hard. And also because it doesn't exist outside the general reality that life is really changing on this earth.
That's true.
And rapidly so. Every day. The way our parents were brought up, they were not prepared for the future. Neither were their parents prepared for the future that was the present of our parents. Right? And at the same time, culture is changing, music is changing, history is changing, politics is changing, everything. Right? And so somebody is coming to you with the tools that were used on them at a time that things were very different. And so there is a lack of elasticity in the way we understand connection as well and parenthood, right? It's funny, she was mentioning the thing about when a child wants to talk about sex and the parent just shuts that off because they think it's inappropriate. I remember when I was 12 years old and my mother busted a love letter I had written to some very lovely Kikuyu girl that I had a crush on. And I don't even know how she got to the bottom of the mathematical set. I have no idea how she sensed and and she beat the hell out of me. Utasoma ama utafukuzana na wasichana. Unajua? I was 12. There's no alternative. So, to hell with my emotions. That's what I'm being told. And your desires, to hell with them. At the same time, I'm having wet dreams. My science teacher is telling me this is what's going to happen to you in bed and da-da-da. Now you'll start noticing your peer girls, their breasts are coming out, their hips. Where am I taking all these desires, man? And these are my classmates. Nakana kwa class. Unajua? But at home, abomination, Then, the year is 2020, pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So 2020, when I was 12, this is the year. So that's 20 years later.
Right.
I'm sat with my mom at a restaurant. And so my mother is asking me, so unajua miaka zimeenda? Sasa unapangaje? never had a single conversation with me about relationships since I was 12. It was like, no girls. Utasoma, you know, and then the next time that conversation is happening is now, where is your person? What are you planning? Right. So I'm wondering, where was I to learn? Even about how to woo a girl and stuff, like where? You know? So that's the thing. I feel like it's so much work and it cannot be left to parents alone. I feel that, you know, back in the day, the way like my parent would go to work and then I'm left with the neighbor. I grew up in a neighbor, so like we were just there as a community. I feel a lot of that has disintegrated, and so much expectation has been put upon the nuclear family to get everything right. Yeah, you're a parent, you're a mom, you're a dad, you have to get the parenting right. So now your child is a teenager, you have no idea how to go about things. You're afraid to show your child that you're a human being who doesn't have to know everything. And for me, that connection part, this is where it comes in. You can do it together.
Right.
Really. Like, let's find out. Yeah? Let's find out. You don't have to know.
Right.
And it's okay.
Right.
You see? So I feel like there's so much fear in not knowing that parents have. And I understand because, again, the child looks at you as their world. You have to know everything. You're their God. You have to know. But then I think we miss that opportunity to make children understand that being human has nothing to do with being all-knowing. Right? And that the best way to connect is to say, I need support here. Even as the person who is older, that you need support. And kids, we underestimate kids a lot. Because they learn. They can tell this one, I can go to this one for this, and I can go to this one for this. That's intelligence, right?
That's true.
So let's start promoting parents being able to humanize themselves so that their children can humanize them as well. Because if I always had that expectation that my father has to do this, this, and this, it's also because he presented himself to me like that.
Right.
Right. If he would come to me and tell me, by the nimesota by the na even do venye kuko. He wanted to show everything was okay all the time. Right. And it wasn't true. Right. So when I wanted it, then it wasn't there. And then what? Then I start hating him. Right. Then I'm becoming bitter. And him is struggling. For real, he's struggling, but he doesn't want to show me that he's struggling. And yet, perhaps sometimes, just sharing it in the family table and loads the burden of having to take everything alone, right? For all of us, you know. So I feel it has to be intersectional. I feel it has to be intercommunal, that parents of adolescents just need to feel that they don't have to know everything. I think that could be very liberating for a lot of parents out there today.
Okay. Yeah. I like that, and I think it can and should also be intergenerational.
Yes.
So that we get to pass it on. I believe we've had to fight ourselves from the concept of I can do it all. And we talked about it in the beginning of the interview. Well, I was a difficult teenager, that's for sure. And my horror stories, we cannot finish them today, of how your parents just know something. They can sniff out that something beyond books is going on, right? But you bring up the concept of community. Them knowing who they can go to when, the children knowing who they can go to when their parents cannot feed them in a certain space. So let's talk a little about group therapy. That concept is not very well known, it's not very well explored. We do it to a certain extent. We sit with our friends, we talked about playing, women showing up, we just chat, even though it's a controlled group. What has been your experience with this? And is this something you've practiced, or do you see it happening, and would you recommend it? Let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, group therapy is a wonderful experience to encounter yourself and other people. I think it does happen. There are actually spaces where group therapy happens, and I think it's valuable for a lot of different issues. So in my practice, I do use it mostly when I'm in corporate spaces. Most individuals come, individually. Okay. Yeah, but then I find that what happens with group therapy is kind of like it's like a microcosm of society. So you're in this space and you're interacting with people, and in a very real-time manner. There are a lot of group therapy practices out there, actually. I know of quite a few that are supporting various different things. I mean, I think we know about these things mostly when it comes to like addiction, Alcoholics Anonymous groups and such things. But there are others that deal with, people who are trying to live abusive relationships or marriages, people who are maybe working through childhood trauma and such experiences in the past. Group experiences exist and they're very valuable.
Okay. So one of the things that we do at the Storybook is build that sense of community, because I noticed when young people are going through their issues or challenges, they want to hide. They want to seem like everything is okay. And that isolation, it can aggravate things. But when we allow people to tell their stories, then they're able to show that it's not you. It's not just you. It's not an isolated issue, and you can get through this, right? And so it's good to know that these kinds of practices are going on beyond the AA groups kind of concept, and we'd be happy to hear from other youth who've tried this and how it's working out for them. So to you, Onyango, what do you think about group therapy, and have you experienced it, and what would you say about it?
I have to say that group therapy is one of the most powerful tools that exist to mankind. To help them navigate difficult emotions. And I say that because it's just one of the oldest tools existing for us, because we've been communal naturally. As primates, as higher beings, we've been very communal, and so group therapy is very sensible in helping us just live life. Back in the day, people used to hunt together. They used to collect fruits together, to cook together, go to work together. We even had things like work songs. Today you can't sit in an office and then now you're singing a work song. So I've had experiences as what Olive has just mentioned there, where it's guided, and there are these tools that are offered to you in the space, and you all process it differently. And then there's also the informal one, where now you just have your people, right, your circle, which maybe I would want to shed some bit of light to that. When I was 21 to thereabout, I met my group of boys who we established a brotherhood. And at the time, we started it off just as a mere Bible study. And of course, we wanted to just come to share what we knew about our spiritual journey and all that. But then in time, we realized that all of us had issues with our fathers.
Right.
Okay. And then now it became a safe space to talk about our fathers. And we didn't plan that, really. Okay. But then what we later on learned was that we were giving ourselves opportunity to experience something our own fathers didn't experience at our age at the time. That sense of brotherhood and community that also kept you accountable when you were growing. We were allowed to make mistakes. Like something would happen and you will not be outcast as like, okay, this has happened, we are mentioning it, right? You can do better, we are here to support you. And what that did, it encouraged all of us to just want to be better with our relationships, with our idea of what a family looked like, with each other's friendships and all that. So in that sense, like in psychology terms, I would say it strengthened my nervous system. I felt stronger, I felt safer, and that took me through those because at the same time, my parents were still fighting at home, it's the same period. So I had a place to go. I would just humanize myself and cry the hell out of that. Man, I was crying all the time. And I just had somebody to just tap my back or make me tea or just tell me, I'm here to listen, and that's all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. In the spirit of that it's a space that you can cry, you can relate to each other, you can speak authentically, make mistakes, and be stronger to go out again and face the world. I like that. So if you are just joining us, thank you so much for sticking with us through the journey. We've been speaking with Onyango Otieno, who's a trauma therapist, and he's also a storyteller on healing. And we've been speaking with the lovely Olive, who's a therapist, psychologist at Prometheus Counseling. And we've been talking about 5 ways, or in fact, they've given us more ways of dealing with mental health issues and how young Africans can maintain their well-being. We'd like to thank you very much for your time as we head out to the closing. Why don't you share with the young Africans out there on, any last remarks? Why should they take their mental health seriously beginning now? Maybe you can share some perspectives on long-term, short-term effects of not taking care of yourself. Yeah, why don't I start with you, Olive?
It's very important that you take care of your mental health. I think that goes without saying. It might not necessarily seem evident, but over time, it just makes you have a more fulfilling experience. I mean, in terms of your work life, in terms of your experiences with your family, in terms of your experiences, your social experiences with your friends, and just a general sense of well-being, which I think is very valuable. More than that, I think it takes you beyond that place of survival into thriving, where you're not just doing things to get by. You sort of unlock a certain level of creativity. And I think that is an extremely valuable thing for you as an individual, but even as you mentioned, because I hear you're addressing Africans, and I think that's really great because as a continent, I think it's so valuable for our young people to move beyond the survival mode and go into thriving. Like now that I am succeeding in taking care of myself and I feel whole and well, how can I give the gift of myself to others? How can I expand my capacity in such a way that it's impacting other people around me? And I think that's how we take ourselves from where we are at now. And I mean, the sky is the limit, really. We have so much opportunity and so much capacity within us. I think that is something that mental health can really give someone, is that capacity to be a gift to others, to be valuable to others.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So thank you for that perspective. And if what I am taking from you is that if you're able to take care of yourself in that way, then you have enough to pour out.
Exactly.
And build the systems around you, the community, and help them be well as well, right? Okay. How about you, Onyango?
Well, there are so many answers to that question.
Okay.
Sadly, we don't have all day. But there's a phrase that I really love that goes, your physiology affects your psychology and your psychology affects your physiology. Your body and mind go together. Mm-hmm. But then many of us, even in this conversation, would concentrate on the mind. And, working in trauma, I learned that our bodies store a lot of what we are really struggling with, right? So you know better, but what you're doing is different because that's the story your body knows. And so for me, it's very essential that we start teaching people how to be present in their bodies, to recognize sensations, to learn how to breathe, because it's breath that keeps us here. Yeah, but if we don't understand breath, then we don't understand life, right? To be aware of who they are becoming, because then it will be easy to even offer grace to others who are struggling with certain things if you understand what you are struggling with. But if you don't understand what you're struggling with, then projection is easy, right? And you end up hurting other people thinking that you're the one on the right all the time. So for me, let's also start thinking of caring for the body. Because when we care for the body, then it is easier to care for the mind.
All right. When you care for the body, it's easier for you to care for the mind. We'd like to give our viewers an opportunity to work with our two lovely guests. So stay tuned on our social media pages and we will inform you how. But for now, let them tell us how you can reach them, perhaps their social media pages, websites, and yeah.
Onyango Otieno on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. The handles are at Rixpoet, that's RIXPOET, and the website is onyangootieno.com.
So Olive Nyakabi, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram on the handle at Prometheus_KE, and the website is www.prometheuskenya.com.
At the StoryBook, we love to build a sense of community, telling you that you can do it, you can change your story, and you can build a stronger future. Those were our guests, Onyango Otieno, a trauma therapist, and Olive Ndiang'ui, the founder of Prometheus Consulting, talking to us about, are you really okay? So that's our story. Be sure to connect with us on our social media pages and on our website. That's www.thestorybook.whitneymwangi.com, and tell us what's your story. See you next time.